Welcome to the Jewelry Journey, exploring the hidden world of art around you. Because every piece of art has a story, and jewelry is no exception.
Welcome to the Jewelry Journey. Today my guest is renowned fashion jewelry designer Robert Lee Morris. Fashion jewelry designer is just one of the many hats he has worn. He is self-taught and started out going door to door to sell his work, and has since garnered the fashion industry's most prestigious awards, including the CFDA Lifetime Achievement Award. We'll hear about his jewelry journey and the factors he sees as contributing to his success today. But first we'll hear from gallery owner Lisa Berman, no relation, who owns Sculptor to Wear here on the West Coast and was recently appointed as the West Coast dealer for the Robert Lee Morris Archives. She'll tell us how she and Robert started working together. Lisa and Robert, so glad to have you.
Great to be here.
Thank you, Sharon. Always great to be here.
Delighted to have you. So Lisa, you're up first.
Okay, well, thank you. First of all, I want to say that I wouldn't really be sitting here speaking to you from the West Coast as proprietor of Sculptor to Wear if it wasn't really for Robert Lee Morris. He has given so much to my journey of studio art jewelry and being able to be a collector, an educator, and a promoter of between fashion jewelry and Sculpture to Wear. I acquired the name in '98 and started in 1999, and it wasn't until 2003, I think it was, that I wrote him a letter. I was too afraid to call him. Imagine me. I wrote him a letter. It was just completely authentic, and I told him how, as a young teenager, how his work influenced me. And when I first went to New York in 1985, when I first started working in the fashion industry in Los Angeles, I visited Artwear. And I was just completely blown away by what this was a completely new world. I had no idea. I'd seen some of the things in the fashion magazines, and then to see the work in real life, it was just incredible. And so it took me until 2003 when I had shown all these other incredible artists and jewelry artists, designers, that I wrote a letter and I said, I would be so honored to show your work and what is now the West Coast version of Sculpture to Wear. I think I hit the send button, crossed my fingers, said a prayer, and then he responded with a very lovely response. And it was a dynamic show. In 2005, he came out, and it was so fun to see. He brought 1/3 of the show were his personal archives that were just from his 35-year retrospective show, right, Robert? And another 1/3 of the pieces were available. And then some of his newer contemporary pieces. And he brought his Dremel, and women were wearing their Robert Lee Morris pieces from the 80s and late 70s, 80s, and he was signing them. It was so fantastic.
Wow, wow.
Such a well-received show. I had to build a tent in the back of my gallery to host his book signing. And then we brought him to LACMA, LA County Museum of Art, and he did his presentation to accompany his book, The Power of Jewelry. And it is still one of the highlights for me personally in my career, but also for Sculpture to Wear's West Coast journey. So I'm so honored and happy to introduce you, Robert Lee Morris.
Well, that's a great story, and great story. Both of you have such fabulous stories, both inspirational in terms of taking risks and just not doubting yourselves, or even if you did, it didn't stop you. Robert, you've covered a lot of ground in your 50-year career. You've been a gallerist, a retailer, a sculptor, a manufacturer. So can you give us an overview of your jewelry journey?
My jewelry journey has really been nonstop, and it's gone on for now it's going into 51 years as I continue into the next chapter, which is going to be even more fun than anything I've done yet, I believe. That's I always think of I see a vision in my third eye, let's put it that way. This is where in my imagination I visualize myself doing these things. And it's almost like magic that if I have the vision of it, I actually can make it come true. I'll just start with the beginning of my story, which was that I was educated all around the world. My parents were in the Air Force, and I was trained and educated in, well, by the time I was 18 years old, my parents had made 27 major moves.
Oh my gosh.
So I was speaking many different languages. I had learned many different cultures, and the most important of those was my 4 years growing up in Japan, where I learned all of the Japanese, they're kind of like samurai arts. You learned how to make a flute, you learned doll making, you learned ikebana, flower arranging, you learned all kinds of very aesthetically pure arts. And this is as a child. Calligraphy, things like that. The normal American child would never even understand what this was about. And we were all doing it. And it was an abrupt change when we were transferred then to Charleston, South Carolina, where I was the only person who'd ever been out of the state by the time I was 15 years old. I mean, it was difficult being surrounded by a lot of, basically, I have to say, they were rednecks in this little town I was in. And I was seen as a freak. So I ended up becoming a kind of a little star of the school in the art department, which in that world was really not a good thing to be. And as I was getting very depressed there in the Charleston area, we were then suddenly transferred to Rio de Janeiro, where I finished high school. And in Rio de Janeiro, I learned all the opposite things that I learned in Japan. And while Japan was all about this aesthetic purity, Rio was all about sensuality and rhythm and sexual energy. And so when I graduated, I then went to a very liberal arts school in Wisconsin called Beloit College. And at that time, it was very progressive. It had an incredibly progressive program of going to school on campus and then going out into the world and getting a job and then coming back and then going back out in the world. So I was having an amazing education. I went in as pre-med, if you can believe it, thinking that I really wanted to be a doctor or a healer of some kind. And I remember when I was a little boy, around 5 years old, I would sit on the steps of our porch and I would sing Jesus Loves Me songs. I was completely convinced that I wanted to be either a preacher or a doctor.
Interesting.
And then years later, as I found myself on QVC live, speaking to hundreds of thousands of people around the country, I was actually doing a combination of being somewhat of a preacher and somewhat of a healer, as I got so many testimonial telephone calls live on air about how women felt when they wore my jewelry and how it soothed their spirit and it spoke to their soul. And so I was gratified that I was following the vision I had when I was 5 years old.
Wow, wow, wow. Well, I just want to mention that we will be posting images of your work with our show notes when we post this on the Jewelry Journey website. And we'll also have a video of your presentation that you gave to, I think it was at Pratt, which really gives a fabulous overview of your whole career. And you couldn't say it in 25 words or less, but just really, so if anybody has a chance and really wants to hear the whole story, to me, it was just very inspirational. But it's interesting because I didn't know how you grew up. Now I see the pieces fitting together with that also. So,
right. And also there are great visuals in that presentation. So many big blow-ups of the jewelry that I'm showing on the slides. And Pratt did a beautiful job of editing that video. So I'm so glad we just got our hands on it and that you can add it to this Jewelry Journey podcast.
Well, it was really fabulous. It just gave me a lot more You know, you clearly, if you Google your name, you come up in many different ways, but this sort of put the pieces all together.
Right.
So you've had many successful collaborations throughout your career. Do you usually initiate those, or do people approach you like Lisa did, or what?
Yeah, no, I didn't initiate any of them.
Mm-hmm.
What I did was I decided to teach myself jewelry after I graduated college. And I taught myself jewelry on a craft commune that I put together with about 8 or 10 of my friends. And we became a real hippie farm, the ultimate hippie farm. And I was discovered first through the craft farm. Someone started to buy my work and sell it for like $10, $12, $15. And I was starting to really get a sense of, wow, I can make a living here as a hippie, you know. And then the farm accidentally burned down and I was forced to leave. I was forced to move to the East Coast and shelter with a friend until I could figure out what to do. And when the horrible winter that I waded through was over, I taught him everything I knew about jewelry making, and the two of us opened a shop in Bellows Falls, Vermont, and it was there that I was discovered by a very famous person, Joan Sonnabend, who had just opened Sculpture to Wear in the Plaza Hotel.
In New York. In New York.
She owned the Plaza Hotel.
Uh-huh.
And the Sonesta, right. So anyway, Joan saw my work. She invited me to come to Boston and show everything I had. And when I did that, she basically said, oh my God, you have got to let us represent you exclusively. We are going to make you famous. There's something going on with you and it's major. And within a year, I was having a one-man show in New York City at Sculpture to Wear, and the fashion editors came and they went crazy because the work I was doing was exactly the kind of thing that fashion needed at that time, and they didn't know it. And I started having editorial coverage. I mean, I had just barely begun making jewelry. And what I was doing was out of a background of understanding about culture, anthropology, sociology, psychology, even biology, everything together informed my work. But the most important thing, Sharon, was that through the sociology classes I was taking, I understood through Marshall McLuhan that artists are the antenna of society. And it is the artist's job, it's his duty to be the conduit for the rest of the people to that mysterious, ineffable land of the imagination, where it is the job of the artist to reach up and pull down everything that is so unmaterial and bring it into the material.
That's interesting. Wow.
Yeah, so everyone has a job in society, everyone has a duty, but the artist's job, because he's got this gift, is to share the ineffable with the public. So that gave me a very, very strong motto, like a code. This was my way of being. I always said, does this match up with my code of honor? And am I making jewelry that truly reflects the society around me? And then I saw myself making jewelry that would be dug up way in the future by future archaeologists. And I was under the understanding by studying anthropology that everything you dug up from the past revealed how that culture worked. And so I wanted everything that I made to reflect the world around me. And so I was very driven. I was very, very driven to be very focused in the ethics of what I was doing. I was so motivated to be a pure artist, not one. I had no interest in jewelry, not really. I had zero interest in setting stones, and I didn't even like really to look at jewelry much. I was interested in how to make things wearable that were like out of my imagination, out of the books of history, like the ancient Romans or the ancient Celts, or what the armor was like, or what the mechanisms, or how they made horse bits, you know, the metalwork and the beauty of the repoussé that was done by the early Celts in gold or bronze or copper. That made me crazy. I loved it. So I was more directed by the ancients. But at the same time, I had a foot in the future. So I felt like I was standing with my left foot in the past, my right foot in the future. And it was my job to bring these two realms together for today. My work had an immediate iconic look. It was simple, it was clean, it was bold, and it was exactly the finishing touch for what fashion designers like to use on their clothes and on the catwalk. So I began to be, Sculpture to Wear closed, unfortunately, because they sold the hotel and they just didn't feel like going on anymore. And the sales of my sale, Sculpture to Wear, was more than all of the other artists put together every year. So that was a problem. I mean, the Picassos, when they sold, they were very expensive, but my work sold every day. And I kept getting editorial and requests for exhibitions. So something wonderful was happening. And then when it closed, I had no choice but to open my own gallery. And that was because none of the stores knew what to do with my work. They had a fine jewelry department and a state jewelry department. They had costume jewelry. But what I was making was completely different. And they didn't know what to do with it. They loved it. I'd already been on the cover of Vogue. They knew who I was, but they didn't know what to do with what I was making. So I had no other choice but to be an entrepreneur. And 3 years after I moved to New York City, I opened Artwear. And I opened it on the Upper East Side, right around the corner from the Whitney Museum. And it was across the street from where Andy Warhol was going to open the Andy Matt restaurant, which never opened, but I thought it would have been a really good location for me. And the only people that really came in and bought things were very wealthy, sort of billionaires from Park Avenue. And they would come in and buy some of the most fanciful pieces and take them out and wear them at Studio 54 and get publicized. So the other thing, Sharon, that's really important is because of my merchandising direction, how I showed the jewelry and how I built the gallery was completely revolutionary for the jewelry world. I created what looked like something out of the Museum of Natural History, like a diorama. I created these tall, room-like cases with sliding glass walls. And I would create these full-blown, like 4 feet, 5 feet, 6 feet high displays using my secret weapon, which was the body cast. I made life cast body casts using 2 or 3 different people whose bodies were amazing. And they were the attraction. People would see the body cast with the jewelry on it, and it was a double whammy. And it created an environment. When they walked off the sidewalk into Artwear, they couldn't tell if they were in a museum or if they were in a store. It was just like a whole new thing. And so that created an enormous amount of publicity. not just with the fashion magazines, but with New York Magazine, with the New York Times, the New York Post, Washington Post. I mean, all the newspapers around the country wanted to do stories about me and about artwear. And it was a sensational time for us. And then we were invited to move to Soho because we were kind of a hot thing and we didn't like being on the Upper East Side. It wasn't very busy there. And we opened on West Broadway at Spring Street, which is the heart of Soho, at a time when Soho was just starting to become known for its art galleries. And when we opened, I had $5 left to my name. It was either that or move back up to Vermont. And next thing I know, hundreds and hundreds of people were coming in a day, and our business just skyrocketed. Wow. And then because of the publicity and the buzz, let's say the word buzz here is major. In New York City, the buzz going on in the world of art and artists and fashion, we were the buzz. And all of the fashion designers started coming by to check it out. And the first fashion designer that grabbed me was Scott Berry. Scott Berry was a Black fashion designer who was very good with sensuous jerseys. Scott Berry with a B.
Okay.
All right, Scott Berry and I worked together a little bit, and I understood kind of what this was all about. And then when I finished with him, I was asked by Bill Kaiserman, who was also a kind of a major name, up and coming, and I worked with him. And then Geoffrey Beene came into the gallery and asked me to work with him. Now, he was known as the god of fashion at that time. Geoffrey Beene, mm-hmm. Literally one of the most respected fashion designers in the world, and an ego to match. And I did work for him, and I worked my ass off. I had to work night after night and take things to him. And I said, no, you're going to give me credit in the program, of course, because he's not buying any of this. He would give it all back to me after the show. And I said, but at least you'll give me credit. And he's notorious for not doing that. And he said, absolutely, absolutely. Well, he did not give me credit in the show. And in the next day in the Daily News, Priscilla Tucker, who is the fashion editor of the Daily News, said the Geoffrey Beene show came alive when the Robert Lee Morris jewelry started to come out on the runway, but Beene did not give him any credit. Well, that kind of launched me. That was, everyone suddenly turned around and paid attention to what I was doing, and he, of course, banned her from any more shows. He wouldn't. The next major thing that happened was Calvin Klein came to me, and the two of us concocted the most amazing fashion collection. And from that, I won my Coty Award. And this was 1981. And there'll be lots of pictures of that. It was one of the most sensational collections he ever did. And he was very young, of course, at that time. And that was with Brooke Shields and Steve Rubell, and we were all hanging out together. So that world was I was getting really involved in this world of the high-end glitterati. And then I started working with Kansai Yamamoto almost simultaneously. And Kansai was one of the most flamboyant Japanese designers. He's the one who did all the clothing for David Bowie. And he fell in love with what I was doing, and he asked me to work with him. And for the next 3 years, I did jewelry for his runway shows, which often were shown up to 50,000 people at a time. So they were extravaganza shows like they have in Paris, mm-hmm. You don't have that in New York, but in Paris, they went all out with sets and crazy drama. So I learned on the job training, and I hung out with all those fashion designers like Claude Montana and Terry Mugler and Christian Lacroix and Lagerfeld. We were all partying together. We would sometimes go to Venice together after the show schedule. So it was a fabulous time, and I was learning so much on the job. And it was shortly thereafter that Donna Karan called me and said, I need to come and work with me, give me some jewelry for this collection at Klein. So I went to her at Klein and started to work with her and Louis Dell'Olio. And 2 years later, she was so successful that they fired her so she would start the Donna Karan Company. And then she said to me, all right, do you want to come with me as I start my new company, or do you want to stay at Anne Klein with Louis? And I said, well, since you asked first, I'll go with you. And that's what history was made at that point. For the next 7 years, we're talking that's 28 collections in a row. Because it's,
oh my gosh.
Yeah, it's spring, summer, fall, and winter, or resort. So I did, and I had a design contract with her, whereas it was Robert Lee Morris for Donna Karan for a couple of years, but then after that, it was just Donna Karan jewelry, and everybody knew it was me doing it. And for that, I received nice amount of money. And plus I had the manufacturing rights. We created and made everything that Donna sold all over the world. So here I am with suddenly a new $1 million business just with Donna Karan. And at the same time, I'm doing my own collections. So I would say by about 1988, 89, things were sizzling. And my brand had become so well known, not only in New York and the major fashion cities of the world, but it was kind of I became kind of a household word for people interested in fashion.
Mm-hmm.
Because I was, there were so many reporters who wanted to write my story, to tell my story, and it would go into syndicated columns in the newspaper, Associated Press, and it would be spread all over the country in every little newspaper. So it was fun. I enjoyed the notoriety, and I enjoyed the glamour, and I enjoyed the pressure of working non-stop like that. So at one point, I was asked to be the keynote speaker at a SNAG, the Society for North American Goldsmiths. They had their annual convention in Atlanta one year, and I was asked to be the speaker, and my subject was how I do 18 collections a year. And that included my 4 for Donna, my 4 for myself, and it included my handbag collection, my scarf collection, the fragrance collection I was working on, the Swid Powell collection for dinnerware, and then there was the men's collection, and then at that point, Donna Karan started asking me to do things for DKNY and for her men's collection, and it was just overwhelming how much work I was trying to do. Anyway, when I finished this talk at Atlanta, 3/4 of the crowd stood up with a standing ovation. The other quarter booed because I was seen by so many of these academic jewelers as a sellout, that I had given in to the pressure of the high glamour world of fashion magazines and all this. And the other 3/4 of the crowd turned on them. And the day went into these wild debates. The fact that I've been published over and over, and so many of these academic jewelry artists, jewelry designers, jewelry design students, had never been published in anything, or if anything at all, it would be a local newspaper. So they were curious to know, how did they get to the point where they can be published like I was being published? And I never thought about it before. I had never, before that lecture, I never thought about how fortunate and how amazing it was that I had been so well covered. And it was because I never stopped. And I was always breaking new ground. And artwear itself, I became known as the father of the designer jewelry movement, who created this bridge between costume jewelry, fine art, and it was called bridge jewelry, also known as designer jewelry. Mm-hmm. And so all of these stores opened new departments for what I was doing. And they would have exhibitions of artwear with all the people that I would have, along with many other people in New York City who I didn't represent because I didn't, they had their own businesses, like Janice Savage, and many other names I can't think of at the moment. But that was I created this new industry for the high-end stores and all the boutiques and all the fashion shops who sold, high-end clothing and accessories. They all wanted artwear. They all wanted the designers that I sold at artwear. They wanted my work. And I didn't know anything about wholesale and manufacturing and all. I had to learn step by step. I remember in the Calvin Klein show alone, that created such pandemonium. The Saks Fifth Avenue wanted to be the launching store for that, and they wanted to put it in all 50 of their stores. And you should have seen me sitting in my workshop trying to hammer out all these pieces. I finally hired someone and to help me, and all they did was sit there and hammer collars all day. I would come in to see them and they'd be like stoned on weed because they were so bored hammering collars all day, like a pile of them. And I realized, wow, this is really turning it. It was almost like I didn't have control over this runaway train, mm-hmm. right? So anyway, I said in the video that you'll be attaching to this, when I received the Lifetime Achievement Award, I said my career was like a bottle rocket on the 4th of July. It just exploded and went straight up and just kept going straight up. And it wasn't until the mid-90s or the early 90s when we had a recession, we had the Gulf War, and all of a sudden there was this reaction against the excess of the 80s. The 80s were a time of tremendous excess in everything. The dot-com business was out of control. The fashion world was so overblown. And I was part of the reason for that as well. Big, bold, crazy jewelry, big shoulders. Chanel went crazy with pearls. Everything was dripping with pearls. And that was Christian Lacroix and the poof. Do you remember that? Mm-hmm. It was a time where it was almost like the golden age of fashion on speed. It was just crazy. And then when the Gulf War hit and then the recession, everybody got quiet. And suddenly there were no accessories being shown in the magazines. Women stopped wearing makeup. They stopped getting their hair done. They stopped wearing belts. Everybody went plain as this kind of statement of penitence. And this was the mood of fashion, and it put a lot of people out of business. A lot of people, like Rhode Island, which was a center of the accessory world in many ways, factories closed right up. Fashion stores all over the country, who were the leading fashion stores, went out of business. Our business plummeted. And eventually I had to sell my company to a giant diamond firm called M Fabricant. And they wanted to buy a designer jewelry company because they knew that was the future. And then I left the fashion business completely and went into the world of fine jewelry. Gold, diamonds, platinum. And then shortly thereafter, I was starting to show my work at the couture show in Scottsdale, where every year they have the creme de la creme of retailers, jewelry store retailers, and the creme de la creme of the jewelers. I'm talking Tiffany and Van Cleef and the biggest diamond companies like Graf. And there I am in my booth with all of this really big jewelry, big silver cuffs. And the retailers would come by and they'd say, well, who in the world would ever wear any of that stuff? And my scale was so beyond anything. Their cases couldn't even hold my jewelry. And I couldn't take it anymore. It just wasn't me. And I ended up, I finally ended up moving to a different company, a costume jewelry company called Miriam Haskell. And Miriam Haskell was the largest costume jewelry company in the country. And they've been wanting Robert Lee Morris all along. They've been stealing my designs and copying them all these years anyway. But now so they bought the company from Fabricant. And then a couple of years later, I'm talking from 2013 to about 2015, 16, pardon me, that whole business collapsed. The costume jewelry business, retail collapsed, brick and mortar started to collapse. And poor Haskell was starting to go bankrupt. And they had to sell themselves to this mega company called Centric Brands, which was a $3 billion fashion brand company. And so that's who I've been with all this time. They own the brand, the trademarks, but they have just filed for bankruptcy too. Oh my God, this jewelry journey is really not over yet, Sharon. So my next plan is I have the rights to use the name Robert Lee Morris Gallery. And I'm going to start my own website, robertleemorrisgallery.com, which will show not only all of my archives and all of the work that I still own that I can sell, but all the jewelry that I purchased from my artwear artists over the years.
Wow. Mm-hmm.
So it'll be like I'm going to be kind of starting artwear all over again.
Wow.
And yeah, so that's kind of where we are today.
So that's very interesting. And in terms of, you haven't really been online yourself until now, have you? I mean, it's like Robert Lee Morris website or whatever.
No, the company, I mean, Fabricant never did a website. And then Miriam Haskell actually did a website, robertleemorris.com, but they didn't know they didn't do a very good job. And they weren't using it to sell products because the products were in the stores. They just used it as a kind of a, just an image thing. And then, but being online this is going to be first for me. And yet the thing that's cool is that I was on QVC for about 21 years. And I started 1999, and somewhere around 2003, 2004, we were doing $15 million a year just with QVC.
Wow.
And I couldn't go anywhere without, bus stops, malls, anywhere in the country, and women would recognize me and come up and tell me what the jewelry meant to them. It was just so wonderful to hear what people have to say about my pieces that they've lived with and worn over and over. And it also gave me quite an enormous span of potential collectors and customers. And so my work has been on an extreme end, from the museum pieces, like the pieces that I'm showing now at the Brooklyn Museum of Art that are part of the Studio 54 exhibition, and the pieces from QVC. And if you Google my name, and you will see page after page after page of either there are news stories that are out there, along with all the different sites that are selling the current fashion collection, which is called it's called RLM what is it called? It's called Robert Lee Morris Soho, I think. That's it, it's Robert Lee Morris Soho. And that's the line that's being produced by Centric Brands, which is my parent company at this point. And they have a team of designers that fulfill the needs for designing new things for their market. And I don't have anything to do with that anymore. They just follow the iconic look of Robert Lee Morris that they have so many examples of.
Well, Robert, that's quite a story, and you've covered so much ground, and I know we've only heard a small piece of it. There's a lot more in your video, and we'd love to have you back maybe when you launch your website. We'd love to hear about your journey online, segueing from brick and mortar to the online world. Thank you so much for being here today, and Lisa, thank you so much. Greatly, greatly appreciate it.
I would love to come back in the next chapter.
Many chapters, it sounds like, and we'd love to have you. And to everybody listening, that's it for the Jewelry Journey today. Thank you so much for listening. And don't forget, we'll have images and we'll have the video posted along with the show notes on the website. And join us for the next episode of the Jewelry Journey podcast, when we'll have another jewelry industry professional sharing their experience. You can find us wherever you download your podcasts, and please rate us. Thank you so much.
Thank you again for listening. Please leave us a rating and review so we can help others start their own jewelry journey.